Hey everybody, my name is Nelson Bird. I'm from Pathecasis First Nation. I just want to welcome you all to this setting that we're in right now. And before we begin, I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands referred to as Treaty 4. It's located in the Treaty 4 area with original lands, Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and of course the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the honor the treaties that were made on these territories. And the festival is dedicated to making this a safe place for everyone. Any hateful language will not be tolerated in the events or in the chat or on YouTube also. The festival would not be possible without support of our major funders. So we'd like to thank the Saskatchewan Arts Board, Sask Culture, Saskatchewan Lotteries, Canada Council for the Arts, and the Government of Canada as well. There's a long list of program funders that will be shown at the end of this event. If you're in a business that you know supports the festival, please be sure to thank them when you can. Now, I want to introduce our guest today. Paul Seesequasis is a Willow Cree writer and currently residing in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. For 4 years, he has curated the Indigenous Archival Photo Project, an online and physical exhibition of archival Indigenous photographs that explores history, identity, and the process of visual reclamation. His photo book, Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun, was published by Penguin Canada in October 2019. And I do have to say, I have the book here in front of me, and I've actually read it. And I just finished it yesterday, and I loved it. It's so educational. It is so informative. When we talk about his photographs, Paul, and before we get to that, let's just can you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you come from? We know where you come from, but just a little bit who you are.
Well, thanks, Nelson, and thank you for that warm introduction. My name is Paul Seesequasis. My family's from here, Beardy's Okmesis. My mom was a nurse, registered nurse. She graduated into nursing college, Humboldt, one of the first generation of Indigenous nurses. That would have been 56 or so. I came a bit later than that. And because she was a nurse, she had to leave the reserve and work off reserve. So I've basically been an urban Cree most of my life. We were in Melfort, Prince Albert, Saskatoon, Regina. So I've traveled a lot of the province that way. Eventually got into journalism, writing, and about 5 years ago began this archival project because I've always been drawn to photography and images. And from there, it just took off, Nelson. So that's who I am.
Good. Now, you talk a little bit about the writing process and then, of course, getting into the photography and archiving all these wonderful photos that I've seen, and it's a combination of not just a book, but also of social media. Tell us a little bit how these two things combine to what you presented.
It was a really interesting process. I never expected it to have this trajectory that it's had, this kind of momentum. It's 6 years ago now, actually, right after the Truth and Reconciliation committee meetings. My mom was one of the honorary witnesses at Wanuskewin when they had the meeting there. And after that, after she had spoken, she just made a comment to me that, because all the stuff was coming out about residential schools and everything like that, despite the hardships of those times, there was strength in family and community. That's why she still is a Cree speaker. That's why our family is still strong. And that wasn't being reflected. And that just got me thinking about, okay, are there images that reflect that side of the reality? So I began to post a few primarily on Facebook initially, then on other social media. And the response was quite phenomenal, Nelson. People just began to respond saying, that's my auntie, that's my uncle. And from there, it just grew.
I like how you talk about, your mother's talking about this, and in our culture, oral tradition, oral stories are really important, and we've heard stories. I've heard them from my grandmother and grandfather and parents, of course. So you're bringing the oral culture to life, basically, in through the photos and through the writings, and was it difficult to do that?
I wouldn't say it was difficult. I would say it was gradual. Initially, my first, and it still is a concern in the project, was the aspect of naming people, because a lot of these photos were taken by non-native photographers. A lot of them were later acquired or sent to archives like the National Archives in Gatineau, Quebec, or to provincial archives at like the Glenbow, that sort of museum, that sort of thing. But often the people in those photos were not named. They just happened to be the collections of a photographer that was now acquired by the public institution. And the problem with that, of course, was, well, people in the community, maybe good chance, did not know these photos. People who were family members of people in those photos had never seen them. So that really opened that door. And once you began to open that door, what you're talking about, Nelson, that oral narrative comes alive. Because what happened on Facebook was that people began to say, that's my auntie, that's my uncle, this is so-and-so, he was a trapper, this is so-and-so, she was one of the first nurses. Those kind of stories began to develop with the photos. And it really was a wonderful kind of combination of the image and the voice coming back together. So in many ways, it was like returning these photos back to the various communities where the pictures had originally been taken.
I find it fascinating in many ways that when one is reading the book and they're looking at the photos and they're reading the write-ups that go along, and there's so many things that in that book that made me go, wow, I never knew that. I never knew about Nunavut, all the dogs, the dog story. That was something I never knew. Now, for those of the people who are paying attention to this and watching right now, just like tell us a little bit about that story in case they haven't read it. But that blew my mind.
Well, yeah, there was a lot of as I was researching in Nunavut with people in the photos, the dogs were so integral to Inuit culture. Up till very recently, and they still are important, but they were the means of transportation, they were the means of navigation, they were critical for hunting, for survival, basically. And basically, in the early 60s, the RCMP began a calling of all the dogs up there. So it was like devastating for the communities, and only recently has there been apologies about that, and within the past decade, I guess it is. So it was a very tragic thing, and it really was, a sign that the colonial authorities had no respect or recognition for the traditional way of life of people up there. So that was one of the stories that came out. It's not one of the happier stories, but I do think within the photos you see the resilience of people even through those times to hold it together and keep it together. And that's really kind of what I wanted the photographs themselves to establish, is that strength and that resilience that exists within individuals and within communities themselves.
And they do. And when a person looks at some of the photos that we're just looking on the screen here, the facial, the expressions, the soul, if you will, that these photographers captured is, when I was reading the book, I'd actually stop and look at a picture, and I would imagine, I wonder what they're thinking. I wonder what they're going to do next. And these photographers, many of them who were non-Indigenous, were traveling there to these places, and what they must have learned, how they must have been welcomed into the community. Like there's one right now of this band that traveled around, and that one, I love that story. This band, this rock band, who would have thought that traveled around?
Rockers, yes, they did that rock tour by canoe.
Yeah. And they got stuck in a storm, and they had to camp on the side of the river. It's. I think this book is not just meant for just. It's not meant for a specific crowd. Who do you think should look at this book, and who should look at some of the work?
Well, that's a good point. I tried not to think about who is the audience here. I respect the individuality of the reader, so I really, as long as the reader is interested, that's my goal, is that it attracts a reader, whether that person is Indigenous or not. But I do wanted to ensure that even though it was for general readership, that the story maintained the integrity the voice of that person in the photo or of that community. So part of the issue with the book initially when it began was there are literally hundreds of photos spread across what is now Canada, and how do I focus this, right? So really talking with the editors, we decided, well, we'll bring it down to 8 communities or 8 regions, if you will, and focus on that. And so I selected those where I'd actually had spoken with people already, or I knew that I could get a hold of people. So that's really what I focused on, to give it some sort of focus. Otherwise, it would have been just too expansive and a bit too, it would have lacked the integrity of being able to focus on particular stories. And that's what I wanted to achieve with it.
Now with the book, it's not too thick of a book. It's actually very readable within a few days or a couple of days, depending on the time that the person has. Looking back and looking at the book, we all as writers, as journalists, as artists, even, we sometimes tend to look back and say, "Darn, I should have done this. I should have included this," or "Why did I put this in there?" Were there moments, or are there moments that you kind of think that way?
No, quite the opposite. Several of the people I've interviewed since the book has been published last fall, October, have passed on. So for me, it was serendipitous that I was able to speak with these people while they were still here and get their story, and didn't have to rely on secondhand. So I think the timing was really important. A lot of these photos were taken in anywhere from the late 40s up to the early 70s. So the further back you got, say the photos from the 50s, a lot of those people were already in their 80s or 90s when I interviewed them. So I just feel the timing was right. And if I had thought about this book, even now, I would never have been able to interview those 3 or 4 people who have since passed on. So the timing just seemed to be perfect for it.
Right, and in the book you talk about this, and you mentioned this earlier in this interview here, that a lot of these photos are in archives, in the national archives, in provincial archives around the province, around Canada and Northern Territories, etc. So, can people access these? Like how accessible are these?
In some cases, very accessible. For instance, the Rosemary Eaton photos from Library and Archives Canada are all digitized and available. You can find them on their website. Part of them have been part of a project naming that the archives has been doing to try to name some of the people from the Inuit communities. So I've worked in conjunction with project naming as part of the social media project. So in general, most of them are digitized and available. The problem is they're all in different places. So one of my hopes coming out of not of this book and of the project itself is to someday construct a database website centralized, so that people, say, doing research and wanting photos from Yellowknife would be able to go there, do a search on Yellowknife, and then they'd come up with all the links to the different archives that have photos from Yellowknife. So it's a lot of work to do that, but that's what I'm hoping is kind of to bring it together so it's a little more centralized and easier for students, researchers, family members to find these photos.
And when we look at the photos, and you talk about project naming, many of us, just people who have photos from their parents that are passed on, and we look at the black and white photos and we wonder, who is that? Is that uncle or is that auntie? Or we have to rely on other people to help provide those names, and a lot of times in my case, it's like, I think that's that's great uncle or so and so, and is that something that we have to rely on the people that are still around? Of course, a lot of them are getting up there. Do you think that there's a chance that we can still preserve and get those names?
I think there is. It is interesting what you say. Sometimes, one thing I've learned over the past few years is when people begin to identify, is kind of, if the discussion is still going on, to let it unfold before, and don't jump on the first comment that says this is so and so, because you might 2 days later someone say no, that's so and so. So you get that kind of thing, because memory is not perfect, and especially as we get older, it's easier to forget names. But on the interesting side is we have been able to name photos going back to almost to the turn of the century, and even the communities they came from. And in some cases, in one case recently, I've been able to send a batch of photos back to that community so they can archive them and have them in their own community. So it's great when you see that kind of dynamic happening. So I like to think that it's never too late for a photo, and there's always a chance someone's going to recognize who that person is in that photo or the story behind it.
Do you see I guess a way that communities are so like we're almost like individual communities all over the province, all over Canada. With my reserve, there's Brearley's, there's Okanee, so all these different reserves and all these family ties, connections. Sometimes we keep those photos in our photo album, in our cupboard, in our drawer, and then the person passes on. They're passed on to someone else, but they're never really shared, never really out there to. And then when sometimes they are shared on social media now a lot. Like I have photos from my own family that I'll take a picture, I'll scan them, and I'll put them up on our own Pepecasis, that's my reserve page, and people are going, "Wow, that's so and so," and that I remember that day. And it's these things that really resonate with people. It's just like it's like a new beginning almost for people. Social media has some good aspects to it, and talk a little bit about the social media part, if you will.
Well, it's interesting because I'm dealing with historical or archival old photos, to put it simply, and we live now with social media, with the internet. Everyone carries around their own camera. Everyone Instagram selfies. Our sense of self and it's so driven by the image. So it's an interesting dynamic for me to take historical old photos and to repurpose them on social media within the context of how our society is today, which is so image driven. And these photos coming from a time when photography was much less common or very uncommon if you go back far enough. So it's just a really interesting contradiction on one level. At the same time, I think it's why the project has been received the way it has is because we are now in an age where we can connect with each other and see these photos and sort of give them a new life. And I hope it's raised the appreciation of photography and of the framing of positive Indigenous images as something that we can cherish and learn from.
Yeah, I understand that, and and you talk about how in this age right now, where the selfie is like the thing. I've seen relatives with hundreds of pictures of themselves doing something, whether they're eating or drinking or doing anything. There's a selfie, and that's the main thing. Whereas I look back to, I remember on my reserve in around 1975, my aunt came there with a automatic camera. Like it wasn't a Polaroid, but it was a big camera that the film was developed as shortly after she took the picture. It was before the Polaroid,
Right.
and it was to us it was a magical because we all posed on the couch. It wasn't just a simple selfie type thing. It was like she set up the camera, we posed. I was holding the cat, and and I remember that day vividly because it was a pretty big deal. Auntie's coming with a camera, with a fancy camera.
Yeah.
And then I still have that photo of us sitting on the couch. And I still remember the feeling, whereas today it's like, let's take a selfie. Let's go outside and take a picture beside that tree or that car. We've come a long way, and not always in a better way.
Yeah.
But
Very true. And yeah, for sure.
what are your memories of growing up in the photography, in looking at pictures and just some of your own memories of being young and similar?
Yeah, well, I think for me, one of the big things to do for me was to look back at my own family and life on Beardy's. And we have, family photos going back to almost the turn of the century. And then they get a bit more recent as the decades progress. But we once you get to the 40s and 50s, I was really interested in seeing my Musham and Cookham, seeing my aunties and uncles as young people, seeing how they lived. And because I missed most of that. I came later, so everyone had trucks or cars by the time I came around. But in those photos, that it was horse and buggy and the caboose that they used to have in winter with the sleds on the bottom.
Oh yes, yeah, yeah.
Horse, I don't know if they had them on Ear Reserve, but they had. My grandpa had this big caboose, and it had a little oven in the middle inside, and they'd travel around in that. And on New Year's, everyone went and visited everyone else, and at midnight they shot their rifles in the air, and all these, things that were part of life at that time. So I was looking for photos that gave evidence of that, and so it was in many ways, though I'm dealing with photos from different communities that I'm not part of. There is a personal connection for me in looking, as you said, at Nelson, at my own family photos and that. So that was important for me as well.
I like the book. Once getting back to the book again, and I just was reminded of the older lady who lived in the woods, and she'd bring her canoe, her handmade canoe into town with her grandson, and it was just her way of life. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, I imagine living in the bush. She's just living her life and comes to town, and there's someone taking her picture. What technology is this, and why? And even the fear that you talk about, and not in the stories, like if you take a picture, it's not always. It's almost like superstitious kind of way, and if you take a picture, part of your soul is gonna go on with that. And I've even heard that growing up from some of my ancestors, and there was always hesitancy to get their photos taken. And you can kind of see it in their eyes too, and you can kind of see in some of the images that there's a little apprehension there.
Certainly there is. And one of the things I really wanted to kind of curate when I brought the book together were those photographers who had some relationship with that community, had spent time there. So they weren't just someone who kind of flew in or flew out, and there was an element of comfort. And the other thing in terms of photography is I was very much wanted day-to-day life, or living off the land, or children at play, just the contemporary life of that time. I really avoided anything to do with, say, ceremony, or anywhere where I felt the camera was invasive of anything sacred, as well as I avoided, to a great extent, any kind of tradition like powwows and things that kind of would fit an outside gaze more. I kind of veered away from those kind of photos. I was really into the day-to-day kind of life, or living off the land, and that's why I wanted to capture with the book. Because for me, the photos I was looking for, photography is always invasive, because we're always, the moment you take someone's picture, you've kind of gone into their, as you said, taking their soul, or taking that moment of their life, and you've frozen it, right? So there's always that, but I really wanted to find where that was not so much an issue, whereas it would be an issue if it was a ceremonial photo, for instance, or someone in their regalia. So I was really had a focus on that.
And I noticed that, and I consciously noticed that as I'm reading the book, that you didn't get into like the things like the the sun dances and the specific ceremonies, which people can learn, whatever if they choose to. What I did like a lot about this book is the historical aspect of treatment by colonialist governments, and just the way that they had to live their life, but also too from the photographer, the non-Indigenous photographer who got to witness all these events happening to the people, and how they would go back and see. They would see firsthand the treatment, and they would go back. And there was even one point, I think, where one of the photographers, it was like a revisiting of the communities too. So they don't just go take a few pictures and go away and forget about it. It stuck with them. I think you captured that.
And I think part of what's told in the book, for instance, Louis Norwegian up in Northwest Territories, and how they pulled their children out of the residential school and built their own school without funding. I mean, so the photos really, when you look at that, they kind of show not just the colonial treatment, but how people found ways to fight against it and undermine it and work against it. And it just hit that note for me that we don't hear enough of those stories. You know, we know about, say, Red Power in the 60s and 70s and start organizing that from then. But this stuff was going on in the 40s and the 50s. So the roots were being laid for it. And I really wanted to pay tribute to that generation that maybe they weren't recognized, but they were doing the work of resistance and of fighting against the colonial system and the Indian Act and the Eskimo tags and all those things that were going on at the time, the residential schools, all that, just group, etc.
And you know, and you say the word Eskimo, and I you know, we've been around long enough to know that, you know, labels, names have changed throughout the years. You know, I grew up on a reserve where Indian was the word. You know, First Nation was never even mentioned until the 90s, and Indigenous was a word that was distant. It wasn't even, I don't think it was used much. It was always Indian. And then the word Eskimo was also one that was used. So now we got these very political correctness times that we're living in now. So we've got to be careful not to say Indian, you know, Native. No, I'm not sure about that one, you know. And the people that I'm around too, they're always asking me, how should we label you? Not so much label, I guess. How do we identify? You know,
Yeah.
and over the, what do you think about this whole, you know, where we're going, where we are now?
Well, I think it's an interesting point you raised, Nelson. I mean, certainly, yeah. And when I was a kid, Indian was it. You know, and I've worked in different places like Ottawa and stuff. And so I've gone from, I think, Native to First People to Aboriginal to Indigenous. And so there's there's a politics to words, and the language will change. And maybe 5 years from now, Indigenous will seem a passé term, and we'll be using it. And then, you know, the ideal thing is to use whatever the people call themselves, you know, that. But if you have to generalize, a generalization is always going to be that, a generalization, because even the word Indigenous, we're talking about such, as we know, such diverse nations and cultures and traditions that it can't help but just be a generic term and not a term that encompasses all the brilliant and beautiful things that make us all different, right? The
Yeah,
language, culture, etc.
and
And how we by the land.
right, and you know, and all those labels aside, all those names aside, you know, we are who we are, and I always make sure that I let people know that, you know, sure, I'm from Papikas First Nation, and I've come through all these different labels too, and today I'm Indigenous. Maybe 5 years I'll be whatever. I can't even imagine what it'll be, but in the book itself, like just the title, why did you call it Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun? That's one question I just wanted to ask.
It's a very good question, because I think there's one photo of a blanket toss in the whole book. I actually, it stuck. You know, my agent had suggested it. I had, you know, kind of different names, as what happens when a book comes together, right? You know, the publisher, the agent, the author, names get batted around, but none of them were sticking. And then my my agent said, Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun. And the publisher liked it, and I thought about it. And I said, sure. And I kind of liked it. It had a poetic sound to it, even though the book has only the one image. It just seemed fitting for a collection of diverse photos from different regions. So it stuck. It stuck.
Yeah, and you know, when I saw the title, I automatically pictured that one image in the book that because we all kind of recognize a symbol of someone being thrown up, the funness of it all.
Celebratory, I think, is the word I'm looking for. Celebratory, and that's why for me it seemed fitting.
Is there something in the book? Is there a write up? Is there a story that really, like, that you just think is one of your favorites, that you just like, wow, I like this? Like, I think that any one of us who read it will have something to take away from this. But is there something in there that you really want people to like, for your own self, your own personal self?
From my own personal point of view, and I've thought about this, there's a lot of stories that were touching or moved me, but I think the one that sticks out for me is Marie Meknek. She's the Anishinaabe woman who made her own canoe and came in with her nephew, the one you made a mention of. And why that sticks out for me is if the photographer John McPhee, who used to work for Ministry of Natural Resources, whatever used to be in Ontario, and he spoke Cree and knew a lot of the people up in the communities there. He just happened to be at that Lake St. Joseph the day that Marie Mechanic was coming in. And if he hadn't been on that beach, and if she hadn't come in on her canoe, and if they hadn't sort of communicated by sign language and she agreed to the photos, we wouldn't know she ever existed. So for me, that story of her living off the land, she's not a famous person. She wasn't a nurse or a political leader. She was just someone who lived off the land. And that meeting for me, I think that's one that sticks out the most for me, just because without me talking with John McPhee before he passed, and him not being on that beach at that moment in time in 1956 or whatever it was, I wouldn't know, the readers wouldn't know, we wouldn't know that she ever existed. So for me, there's something kind of magical about that kind of, and that her image now is in time. We have it in those beautiful photographs. So for me, I think that's the one that stands out.
I really like that story also too. The photographers, let's talk a little bit about the photographers that had spent all this time up there, and as we said earlier, a lot of them non-Indigenous who have their own lives and their own stories. So some of them were traveling the world and going different places and ended up in James Bay or wherever they did. Tell us a little bit about those photographers.
Okay, yeah, I'd be glad to. I'll pick up a couple of examples. One is Rosemary Joliet Eaton. She is in the beginning of the book. A lot of the photos from Nunavut are of her. She actually came from England in the mid-50s and was one of the first women photojournalists. It was a very male-dominated profession then. It still is a very male-dominated profession, but even more so then. And what's interesting about her is she came from England, and for some reason she's, again, something that wasn't common then. She went with her a girlfriend or two, and they just traveled the country, and she began to take photos, and she began to sell them to what was called the Beaver History magazine then, and gradually some other newspapers. But she took photos of day-to-day life, and I think partly because she was a woman, she was able to get photographs of women doing women's work or beading or with their children that a male photographer in the late mid-50s, 1950s, probably wouldn't have got. So she's interesting to me. Another photographer who's interesting is James Jerome, because he's one of the first native Indigenous photographers in the book. He's Tlingit, up from Teslin. And he was interesting not just because he was an amateur photographer and took photos of his communities, but he also brought a 28 Chevy, the first automobile, a 28 Chevy, up to Teslin and opened up, which is probably the first Indigenous taxi service in North America. So, and then that winter he put chains on the Chevy so they could go across the frozen river, right, and lake. So he was also another interesting character. So you get these kind of stories of people adapting, and so it's not just the photos; it's how they live their lives. So those are just two examples I can offer.
I do like that story. I like how you're not just touching on the photographer and naming them. They're actually a little story that each one of them has too. And there's one photo in here it's not up on the screen as much. I don't think I've seen it, but it's a Rosemary Eaton photo, and her friend Elma Houston and Andrew are I don't know if you guys can see this or not, but it's a great photo, and it's just a look in their face, in their eyes as they're sitting there talking. She's got and it's described, the piece of paper in her hand, and his coat, his medal that he's wearing a medal.
Yeah, he was a really interesting chap, and he used to make people laugh by doing imitations of the royalty, because I guess at some point he'd meant it was the Queen Elizabeth, King George the Sixth, or whoever the last one was. He'd met him, so he kind of would imitate royalty and just crack up people in Kingate. So he was an interesting character, and I think in that photo, Alma Houston was one of the people who helped get the art scene going up there, and I think she's probably learning Inuktitut and maybe has mispronounced a word or whatever, because you can just see them laughing together. So that's awesome. I like that. It's one of my favorite photos as well.
Me too, and it just captures the humanness, the personality, the traits, the characters of those two people specifically. And another one that I really like too is this one here. I'll show you if you guys can see it or not. But it's by John McPhee, and it's a guy making birch bark art with his teeth, and it's a it's a great photo. And you guys see this guy who does art, probably fantastic work too, because if anybody's familiar with birch bark basket making or the biting, birch bark biting, which I've been fortunate to say that I've been able to do that in my life once.
And you come up with a design, or?
I did. We were. I was up north, and I'd spent a lot of time in northern Saskatchewan. We were visiting this woman named Sally McKenzie, and she did moose calls, and she taught us how to make baskets. We didn't make a basket because I didn't have time, but she did give us each a square piece of soft birch bark, folded it nicely, and then I'm the only First Nation guy besides her, and my white guys, my crew was with me, and we're all doing this, and I did it, and it was actually a nice little design. These teeth right here, so I kept that. I still have it, and it's. I think that what's really important is for any journalist, for anybody who gets to take part, or a photographer, is to actually take part. I think it's really important, and you would know this, Paul, is that if you're ever an opportunity to meet people, to interview them, it's not just you walk in, take a few pictures, talk to them, and leave. I think how important is it to actually sit down? Like for me, it's vital.
Well, I think I think you've said it. It is vital, and it's the more I guess you open you are, and the more humble I guess you are in terms of coming from wherever you're coming from outside the community, and the more you acknowledge that and just be with the community, the more that they're going to trust you, the more you're going to get a sense of the humanity of the people you're spending time with, and the more comfortable they are going to be to share things with you, from food to stories. And that's part of the human experience. And it's really, I think it's an empowering thing and a healing thing. So it's really, as you say, it's a really important attitude to have in life. And if you have that attitude, you're going to encounter a lot more interesting and things than you are if you come in, sort of arrogant or with your own preconceived notions of how people are in that community, even though you've never lived there. So, and that was kind of for me, really, with the book itself. I really, from pretty early on, I really tried to let the people from the communities, their voices speak for themselves. I tried not to keep myself out of it as much as I can. It's hard. I mean, you are, because you're writing it, you are part of it, but I was very aware of not putting in my my theory or my projections onto these images, because that's one of the things with photography is the picture often can speak for itself if we let it. And if there's a narrative to it, it's just one part of that whole story. So I think we always have to be aware of that balance. And that's why I kind of wanted to keep my own personality out of it as much as I could.
I think that one of the things that artists, photographers, writers, journalists, if a person is watching or following or reading the book in this case, I don't have to know who you are. I don't know who you are personally, but I found that as I'm reading it, I got to know who you are. It's this subtle thing that happens whenever I'm reading a book, no matter, especially nonfiction, that you get to know who's writing it without having to actually look at the bio and say, okay, this is the kind of person he is. He's a good person. He's telling it because, believe it or not, I think a lot of people who read this book and are looking at some of the colonialist and government treatment towards people are like appalled, is going, oh my God, I had no idea. And that's why I highly recommend that this book be in schools. I'm going to recommend it to my staff who want to learn, especially for those who really want to learn about our history. This is a good resource.
Well, I appreciate that, Nels. Thank you so much. That's very kind of you.
I'm just going to remind people right now, if they want to have any questions or anything else, we're going to open it up here pretty soon. So we have our tech standing by here to.
Awesome. Let's see how this works. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Okay, we got a couple. Okay, so we got a couple, so we can start. Let's start now.
Okay, sounds great. I'm all set.
Okay, so the question, and do you have a favorite photo from the book?
Do I have a favorite photo? Oh, it changes. I'll be totally honest and say no. But what happens is I'll go through it, or I'll think about a photo and the story that went along with it, and it varies. There isn't a favorite photo. I think there's maybe a half dozen or so that are kind of, I shuffle around like a deck of cards. That one's my favorite. No, that one is. So I let them all be where they are, and I'll say I have a few that are near the top, but not a single favorite.
Okay. That's a good answer. Safe. Okay, I want to ask another question here. I'm wondering if Paul will be coming out with another book, as this one has only some of the beautiful photos he's collected. Some of the beautiful photos. Yeah. There's probably a lot more.
Well, a couple of things. That's a really good question. And I do want to just remind people that the book is only one part of this project. There actually has been a traveling exhibition that's been in Nelson, Swift Current. It's going to Toronto. Everything it was in Calgary. There's been a couple in Calgary as well at the Glenbow Museum. But of course, in March, exhibitions came to a screeching halt, right? So that's been on hold, but there are traveling photo exhibitions. So I really want to encourage, once we get back, hopefully, knock on wood, wherever wood is here, once we get back to where it's kind of safe for people to come together again, to get the photo exhibition side of this going, because for me, it's important for people from the communities to actually see the physical photos on the wall. It's a different experience when you see them on the wall or than in a book or on a screen, and then you're sharing it within an exhibition space. And so I'm hoping that photography exhibit thing it'll be safe to start doing that again. And yes, I am working on another book based on photography. It's a little bit different than Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun was, but it will be coming out probably in about a year and a half. I'm at early stages right now on it.
And you're still very young. You got lots of time left. Okay, another question here. I'm wondering how Paul's experience in Indigenous publishing and media impact his style in the book, and how he chose to tell the stories of these diverse communities in the photos.
That's a really interesting question. It's not one I've thought about, actually. I was very unconsciously never thought about. I think working as a journalist, and I mean, I still in some ways consider myself a journalist, but I'm not a working journalist. I don't wear that hat because I know how hard it is to be a journalist, and I know story assignments and deadlines and all that stuff, which I'm thankful is a previous chapter in my life. All due respect to journalists, but I just, I don't need that stress. And I never was totally comfortable with, news reporting and stuff. I always felt like a prying eye, right? And I'm sure you've working in media, you know that feeling as well, right?
I do.
So, but I do think I was aware as a journalist that I was trying to strive to present the viewpoint of the story that went with the photo. So I think on that aspect, that journalism experience was evident in the writing of the book itself. So I do think, given responding to that question, yes, it definitely was an influence, and it's a good question.
Okay, good. Another one here. I'd be curious to hear about the research and interviews that were done to tell the stories. The pictures were beautiful and the writing was fantastic and brought the whole thing together. How was that process?
That's a good question. It was sometimes very quick, sometimes very slow. For instance, on some of the photos, like we were talking about the rock band earlier, Fort George Rockers and James Bay Cree up there. Some of those people I had wanted to interview, and I was trying to call them, and it was goose hunting season. So, I had a deadline coming up, and of course, no one's around. And, answering the phone to stop your goose hunt, which is a big part of life up there, to talk to some dude from the south who wants talk about an old photo, was not a priority, right? So I quickly learned to be humble and just be patient. So the interviews themselves probably took place over, it was at least a year and a half, almost 2 years. And in some cases, I had tried to contact that person a year before, never heard anything, had almost given up, and then they called me back. And then we got the story. So that kind of determined which stories made it into the book. There were others that didn't, that actually did get responses or came together, but it was too late to put into the book, or they just didn't fit because they're off. It was one story on its own that was not from a community that was in the book. So that was the process. It was a lot of patience and being humble and being respectful of people's time and of waiting.
Mm-hmm. That's always key, is to be respectful of so many people when we're working on things and interviews. I know that.
We're so used to speed and emails and quick response. It's a different. You have to be able to think outside that box.
Exactly. The next question is based on something Paul tweeted on Twitter. How can we learn more about the history of Indigenous people in Saskatchewan when these stories are mainly oral or lost in some cases?
That's a good question. I think there's really a growing body of good writing coming out on Indigenous history now, of Indigenous culture by Indigenous authors and writers. So I think the situation, both on a nonfiction side, say within schools or universities, the books that are available now compared to, say, when I was a student, it's so much more material is available. So I think it's there. I also think with internet now and search engines and different Indigenous studies at different universities or at libraries, we're now able to access material. So I think it takes a little bit of work, but I think that a lot of that oral history and narrative has now been transcribed or is available. And in many cases, as you know, Nelson, some reserves, some First Nations have developed their own, have started to develop their own website and their own, you mentioned your own family photos, have started to collect those things and make them available through social media. So for me, that's also a really democratizing aspect of, we know about some of the negative sides about technology, but there's a positive side in that it also enables communities now to share some of their local histories in the region or whatever. So I think with a bit of diligence and a bit of research, we're a much better place now to find our histories than we were even 10 years ago.
And if I could add to that, one of the things that's happening in that I see as a person in the media is that, and I love the question about the oral history being lost, is that, it's up to us, it's up to me and to other journalists out there to share those stories. Sometimes we're viewed as journalists as, the nosy media, avoid that person, don't talk. But in some cases, it can be positive. A good example is Cree Seesequasis, who's now in Saskatoon. His mission, his purpose is to gather those stories and to share them with the public. So they're all kept in an archive somewhere, the stories that I've done over the years, stories that he's doing now. So there are, and I think the key is listening in all things that we do, is when we hear a story from an elder, from an uncle or an aunt, is that it's important that we listen very carefully, and so we can tell someone else, and it's passed on. That oral tradition is not lost, in my opinion. It's still there, but now we have this opportunity, as Paul says, to write it down, put it on social media, to put the pictures there with it. So it's still there.
I just to add to that, your point, I think the other thing that is different in what we learn is patience and a different aspect of time. Because sometimes to get those stories, or those stories are long, we, over tea or whatever, we have to be willing to sit there for an hour, 2 hours. And we're in this day of modern technology and speed, I think we're so acclimatized to grabbing everything quickly and 5-minute sound bites, and that orature exists on a different time scale. And I think that's something, as we learn that, it also enables us, as you're saying, the excellent work of cataloging and of getting some of these stories.
And also, too, just so people are aware, places like Waniskewan Heritage Park, they have a research and history department there that I visited, and I saw that there are like hundreds of cassette tapes of elders in the communities that people have done. Universities, high schools, these oral traditions are still out there, and they're kept. People haven't had time to transcribe, to post them, to put them in anywhere. So they're still there, and I hope to see someday that they're shared.
And that's the other thing too, is that the technology changes, so it's important. Some of these are on tape, and they need to be transferred onto newer technology. So that's really always a challenge. And I also encourage people, if they know of photos that are kept in their families, to ensure those photos are put in a safe place and together, because I think so much of our history, visual history, is maybe lost in a garage somewhere, or water damaged, or something happened to it. So that it's really important for communities that we preserve our visual photographic.
I agree. Another question here: is there information in the book about the cameras and formats used? The photos are so clear and crisp.
Not so much. I allude to it, but in some of the cases, we don't know what camera was being used, because the photographer is no longer here. Only the photos are here. So there's a little bit of that, but on the technical side, not so much. We know some of the form. I mean, a lot of the color ones were early Kodachrome. And John McPhee, we talked about earlier, one of the photographers who just passed just a year and a half ago, had talked about how warm and vibrant Kodachrome was as a color. And I think that's why we respond to the beauty, because it has that color has a natural warmth to it. So we know some of that technology. We know Peter Pitsiliak, the Inuk photographer, who along with his wife was one of the first Indigenous photographers, that they actually developed their film initially in a tent under a red blanket. They found a way to make their own little darkroom. So I think people were quite creative and resource handy, particularly up north when they're doing photography in the 50s and 60s. So that's technical side, but certainly they had to be able to adapt.
There's a photo that just pops up every now and then here. It just when you talk about the technology and the light capturing, it's very resonance of an Allen Sap. It's the two older ladies who are standing beside their carriage, and the horse and the dog is nearby. As soon as I saw it, before I read anything, I looked at it and I thought, that looks like an Allen Sap painting.
It's a very good point. Yes, it's a beautiful, the sort of the sepia tones to the colors. It's a gorgeous photo. That was taken by interesting photographer Everett Baker, who actually went on to found the Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society. So his photos are really invaluable for a lot of the history of the 30s, 40s, 50s, both reserve and non-reserve in Saskatchewan.
Great. Another question here. I wonder if this book has created unexpected experiences for Paul, taken you to places and surprised him. If it has, we'd like to hear a story of, of some of the anything that unexpected may have popped out in you.
Oh, good question. There's so much. I think what popped out at me, or what was really surprised me, was just people's willingness to share their stories with me. The honor it was to talk with some of these people while they were still here. And a lot of the people I interviewed, as we mentioned earlier, were, at the time of my interviewing them, were in their mid-80s up to their mid-90s. So it to talk with those people. And what struck me the most was just, say, a person like John McPhee, that their recollection and memory of events of 60, 70 years ago was so sharp. Like, and it just made me think of, how, because he remembered taking particular photos at the moment in time, and just how the photograph and time, and as we get older, just how important that connection is. So if anything struck me, it was just that I was really blessed and fortunate to be able to capture some of these interviews with the people while they were still around. So I just felt the timing was meant to happen somehow.
Another question here, Paul Seesequasis. What are your reflections on the history of Indigenous people in archives and how Indigenous life has been archived? How do you see your work responding to this history?
It's again another question. I think that could be a whole 2-hour discussion. Okay, let's start with on the negative side. I think there's always been an issue with our objects, whether they're sacred or day-to-day, being put under glass and with a tag beside them saying what they are, right? And then people going to see them. And that's part of colonial history with any all over the world, is that the colonizer takes what they see as other or as exotic or as interesting and puts them under glass. So that side of the institution, I think we're starting to see in the past few decades, people working to decolonize the archive and the museum, etc. I think some of looking specifically at photography, it's a little bit different because these aren't singular objects. Most of these are based on negatives that can be turned into prints. So they're not like a singular thing, right? So those photos can be brought back to communities. The prints archives can make the steps to ensure that communities receive the photos, or that family members receive the photos that are part of a collection. And for me, that's really an important thing. It's why I really like what Library and Archives did with Project Naming, was to bring Inuit elders together in Ottawa and to go through the Rosemary Eden photos and to work on identifying them. Not that Rosemary Eden didn't take notes, she did, but other than a researcher would have to go through her journals and go through the hundreds of photos and bring them together. So that, that hasn't happened. So for me, it was important, those kind of initiatives. And I'm just hoping that we can continue to see and the archives be democratized and be decolonized and be maybe more of a visual reclamation, if you will, to the various communities and regions, so that these photographed histories of our ancestors really belong to us.
And that's so important. This one photo here, it's not popping up on the screen as much, but I want to show this one here if you guys can see it. Yeah. It's the young girl holding a beaver foot purse, yeah, and her story. And you talk about how things can be, taken and put away in a archive or behind glass. And this girl in this picture, saw it when she was a much older lady.
Exactly. Yeah, that was Emma Alford. Emma Alford. Yeah, from Pelly River.
Yeah, it just amazed me that that this picture was taken, and then eventually that purse was lost and then found again. So there is hope for some of these archival pictures and things that were out there to be returned, repatriated.
Oh, yeah. There is, yes.
And we're going to take one more question here because we have to wrap up soon. But how old does a photo need to be in an archive, would you say?
Interesting. I think that really varies by the archive and their policies and what they'll accept. And archives will not accept. I mean, you can't just call up, say I just can't call up Library and Archives Canada and say, I've got my family photos, here they are. They acquire things, right, based on what their mandate is. And one of the interesting, it depends. Well, one, it depends on the institution. I would say 50 years is a guesstimate or general approximation in terms of when they would have a historical value. What's happened in recent years with this project is I've had private collectors begin to send me photos. People whose people whose dad was a doctor up north and took photos from all up north. So I'm starting to get private collections in, which is for me is another important part of this. So it's not just libraries, archives, it's private collections of people who are in those communities that have never been put into a archive or a museum or library. So that's another important step.
We have one more question here. I'm just going to wrap up. So, a family member can be designated to be the keeper of your family's digital legacy. I like that idea. Who will keep this data safe in the passing of a family genealogist? What are your thoughts on that?
Ooh, that's really an interesting question. My thoughts are, I think the person's really hit it on the head, that whether it's a tactile object or whether it's a digital collection, it has value and it needs to be protected as much as we can. We've all seen the memes of chiefs with sayings under them that they never said, right? And that's an extreme example of misuse of our ancestors' photos. But I also am very aware of ownership, visual reclamation, and that these photos really belong to the community. So if a photo is made into a T-shirt, for instance, without the permission of either the individuals in that photo or the family involved, it's one thing to get permission of the museum or the archive, but it's another thing to go the step further and get the permission of the family or the community that photo's from. So I think that's really an important step that I would like to see happen in terms of digital collections.
I think we're in an age now, and as we move forward, that we have these different archival institutions out there. Whether it's the First Nations University of Regina has a great library, and they take photos and items, and they catalog them. So it's safe, I think, but I don't think they will just take anything. But I think they do have their own criteria, I would imagine. Like we said earlier, we all have our old photographs that we want to think that, hey, this should go in the archives. It's auntie and uncle, and they're sitting by the river, or whatever. Like, I guess it has to be a certain, like you mentioned, there's something has to be they're special to us.
Yeah. Museums have they have their own budgets, their own mandates. There's a whole many layers to it. So it really is dependent on that particular institution.
Well, you know what, Paul? It's this hour went by so fast, and I just want to thank you and all the people who've been participating and asking questions and listening to your great stories. I recommend this book so much, and pick it up where you can. Blanket toss under the midnight sun. I'll give you the final word, Paul. What do you want to say?
Thank you all. Thank you all for everyone who's read the book or is interested in reading the book. And we can always learn from the photos, old photos, and I think they resonate today. So I'm very grateful for the interview and being able to share time with you. Thank you also for the questions, both from you, Nelson, and from everyone out there on YouTube. And to the festival, of course.
Yes. Thank you guys for asking us here.